Good afternoon. Welcome. It's Darlene McLennan here, and on behalf of Attend ADSET and the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled Supporting Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder in Higher Education, with a focus on the design of the built environment and how this affects students with autism spectrum disorder. Before we go to our presenter, I just want to discuss a few housekeeping items. We do have an internet issue at the University of Tasmania where this is being hosted and where our presenter is placed at the moment. So we're hoping that we won't drop out, but we may. I'm placed somewhere else, so hopefully I can tap dance to keep you all entertained. It should only take a minute for our presenter to come back, but I do apologise if that happens. To let you know that the webinar is being live captioned by Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. The recording will be placed on ADSET after we've captioned the recording. Also, unfortunately, the GoToWebinar platform is not as accessible as we would desire for screen reader users, such as people using JAWS. If you are a screen reader user and have any questions or any comments to make, you are able to email us at adset.admin@utas.edu.au. All participants have been muted. This is to ensure that we have little background noise was received during the webinar. We encourage you throughout the presentation to ask questions in the question pod, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time to go to those questions and ask our presenter. But firstly, I'd like to actually welcome Sue Trinidad, the Director and Program Leader of the National Centre, to give us a bit of an overview of the centre and the research that's currently being done. So over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Darlene, and welcome everyone. We're very, very proud to be partnering with ADSET today to bring you Dr. Owen's report and her colleagues who've been doing this fascinating research from the University of Tasmania. And this was one of the grants that was funded through our competitive research grants program. We have had two rounds, 2014 and 2015. We now have 24 research reports. We have published the first 12 and they are all found on our website. And this next 12 research reports are being released as we go through the next 6 months. So this report was released on Monday and we've already had some very positive feedback. And I'm very interested in listening to the presentation that's going to be given to you today. So I'll hand you back the publication that encapsulates the next 12 reports will be released in July, so you'll have a written version as well as what is found on the website. So I'll welcome you to come and have a look at our website, and that is at ncsehe.edu.au, and I will just post that up to the chat area as well. So thank you, Darlene.
Great, thank you, Sue. Now moving on to our presentation, I'd like to welcome Dr. Caridwen Owen, who is a Senior Lecturer and Program Director in the School of Architecture and Design at the University of Tasmania. Caridwen will actually speak for around 45 to 50 minutes, and as I said before, please feel free to enter your questions into the question box, and I will ask some questions at the end of the presentation if we have time. So over to you, Caridwen. Thank you.
Thanks, Darlene. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. Thank you so much for Darlene for inviting me to do this. And of course, thanks to Sue and everyone at the NCSEHE at Curtin University for funding the research on supporting students with autism spectrum disorder in higher education. It's on the next slide. You're hearing from me today, and I was one of the lead investigators, the lead investigator for this research, but I would like to acknowledge my other participants also from the University of Tasmania, Dinah McCann, Christopher Rayner, Carol Devereaux, Fiona Sheehan, and Lindsay Quarmby, as well as a fabulous range of research assistants and our advisors, which included Darlene McLennan and Mary Brake as an autism consultant with the Department of Education. It was a wonderful opportunity to work with this multidisciplinary team, which was really a core focus of the research in understanding the complexities and interactions between various aspects of the higher education context in supporting students with autism spectrum disorder. So the next slide, I'm just going to talk to an outline of what I'm going to cover in the presentation today. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context for the research and in relation to autism spectrum disorder specifically. I'm then going to talk about issues to do with disability supports and pedagogical initiatives somewhat briefly, but as Darlene mentioned, the focus of the presentation today is going to be in my area of expertise, which is in relation to the design of the built environment. And then I'll finish with conclusions and some of the limitations and future research that we'd like to head towards. So on the next slide, I start with the context, and I think I have a broad audience today, and I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with autism spectrum disorder, but for those who are less familiar, this is the broad definition of autism spectrum disorder as a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by difficulties in social communication and interaction and restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. Underlying this, importantly for the research in relation to the built environment included in the ASD symptomatology are differences in the processing of sensory information, which include both hypo and hypersensitivities to environmental stimuli, and also cognitive differences in perception and the way people with autism spectrum disorder make sense of information, including the built environment. The range in severity and diversity in profile, as well as the co-occurrence of a range of other disorders and indeed learnt coping strategies, particularly amongst adults, can make diagnosis very difficult, particularly if it's not identified in early life. On the next slide, I'll talk about some of the specific challenges for students with autism spectrum disorder in higher education. They're not only academic challenges, but they also include managing everyday life and independent study, so that transition between the school environment with very structured activities to that requirement in higher education for people to be more self-directed, and of course in transitioning out of the home for those people who are not living at home while they're at university. Also difficulties in social engagement, socially mediated learning experiences, and disclosing and seeking assistance. There has been a documented increase in the numbers of students with autism spectrum disorder undertaking higher education, but there will be many, many more in those of you who are at higher education institutions than are listed with disability support services. There can be a reluctance to disclose and seek additional instant assistance when required, with attempts with people to cope by themselves. Further to that, the support needs are very complex, often highly idiosyncratic, and at odds with individuals' apparent intellectual capacity. The disability is invisible, which can make that awareness of staff and peers is a particular problem. Traditional academic accommodations that are provided to students with disability often do not address the specific needs of students with ASD. However, they also have strengths, passions for particular fields of interest, and an ability to adhere to institutional rules can actually be beneficial in the higher education environment. So on this next slide, I'm going to talk about the scope of the study and the methods that we employed. The study was undertaken in 3 parts. First of all, we undertook reviews of literature in the area of disability supports, pedagogical initiatives, and the design of the built environment. We also concurrently undertook an online survey via a questionnaire distributed to people in disability supports areas in higher education institutions around Australia. So that was to enable us to provide a baseline of understanding what supports are currently available in Australia and what are seen to be some of the most successful supports. Finally, of course, we wanted to understand in an in-depth way the experience of students with autism spectrum disorder in higher education. And we undertook a self-directed photography study with some students at the University of Tasmania. We recruited 6 students for the study. 5 of them were able to complete it. It involved giving them a camera and a diary with some prompts and asking them to explore and to document any aspect of their environment, their experience of studying at the University of Tasmania, whether it be positive or negative. And then when we received the diaries and the photographs, we then undertook interviews of approximately an hour in length to using the photographs and the information to drive that, but to have a better understanding of what those underlying issues were. And that's the information that I'm going to spend the majority of time talking to today. So on this next slide here, I'm going to talk about the disability support and pedagogy in relation to the literature. And this slide is a graph which shows the number of papers in the journals across time. And what you can see here is an enormous spike as we move towards the last 2 or 3 years, which shows a huge increase in awareness and interest in this issue. On the next slide, here's some of the themes that emerged from the literature. So these themes include the need to support effective transitions into the university, orientation within the university, the need for collaborative multidisciplinary approaches, the need to involve parents, other support networks outside of the university, the need to work with peers, academic staff and disability staff within the university for the most effective supports. A large emphasis on peer mentoring as a key mechanism of support within the university, the need to focus not only on academic skills but also to develop students' social communication and self-advocacy skills. A need to create awareness amongst all staff of some of the sensory processing differences with students with autism spectrum disorder, and to develop professional learning for staff in relation to the needs of students with autism spectrum disorder and inclusive teaching practices. On the next slide, I'm talking about the existing supports that we discovered through the survey via the Ofsted network. And the survey findings really reinforce the information from the literature. There was a strong emphasis on the provision of individualized assessment of students with ASD and support to reflect the specific needs of each student. Types of support that were normally included were transition support into university, focus on study and organizational skills, facilitating social or personal development, and the implementation of specific strategies to address some of the challenges that students with ASD experience. And the key methods included mentoring, education of staff, the learning access plan process, and in some cases external liaison. Now, this next slide is the start of the section where I would like to talk about the built environment. And I'll start with talking about what we discovered in the literature. The key issues experienced by students with autism spectrum disorder that relate to the built environment are primarily to do with differences in sensory sensitivities, the hyper and hyposensitivity, and also this perception, the ways of making sense of the built environment, which can lead to disorientation, not knowing where to go or what to do. And because of the diversity on the autism spectrum, there's a need for a great variety of different spatial conditions and a real key need for what we'll call safe spaces, spaces that are more comforting, spaces of retreat, the opportunity to escape when things become too overwhelming. It's evident from the literature that there is a lack of research in this field. There's very, very little specifically in relation to higher education. Most of the work has been done in relation to autism-specific schools, early learning, and in housing, again, for specifically for people, adults with autism spectrum disorder. There's also very, very little in policy development and guidelines. So while we'll talk about universal design or inclusive design, which is very broad in its aspirations, whenever that's listed in a specific criteria, that generally comes down to issues of physical mobility, from wheelchair access, or to accommodate people with vision impairments or hearing impairments. There's very, very little about cognitive diversity. The other thing that was evident from the literature is we could find information in literature where students were talking about their experience of being at university, and they did bring up issues of built environment, whereas staff understanding of that, it was never ever raised as an issue, particularly in relation to the sensory sensitivities. So this next slide I'm going to talk about an overview of the study. So as I mentioned before, we undertook the study at the University of Tasmania, focusing on the student experiences, the 6 students with autism spectrum disorder, although only 5 completed the study, and the approach of self-directed photography. So the next few slides, what you're going to see is some examples of the photographs, some of the quotes that either come from the diaries or from the interviews, and I'm going to talk through a variety of the themes that emerged around the built environment. So the first one of these is related to the sensory experiences, and I think this quote is very powerful and very sort of simple and a very polite plea. Just it's a picture of a clock and the ticking clocks, and it simply says, please find an alternative for these. If you have a look around the university environment, they're incredibly prevalent. This just shows something about the acoustic sensitivities and how distracting even these things that we would normally ignore can be for students with ASD. It's not only acoustic sensitivities are very common, but also sensitivities to visual stimuli, as well as this lack of understanding about why certain things are if they don't seem to follow a pattern. And this quote that just says, simply looking at the chairs, the variety of coloured chairs, I can cope with this unless I am tired or stressed, would not, for most of us, even seem to be something that we would need to cope with. We might not like it, we might find it a bit strange, but the fact that for this student is actually an embedded anxiety around being in this lecture theatre. This next slide shows a picture of one of the new learning spaces at the University of Tasmania with a very highly patterned carpet, which this participant says, when I was taking this photo, I felt nauseous, physically sick. And in extra information about this photo for the researchers, she says, "This carpet is new. I liked the old plain one." This is there's a variety of the sensory issues here that include visual stimuli around the patterned surfaces, lots of groups of people, lots of colour, lots of things, also glary screens and glary lights and flickering lights that make these environments very overwhelming. The consequences of this sensory experience for students, as this participant articulates, he says, you lose the ability to think or process. You're essentially stupider in these environments. So obviously this has large consequences for academic attainment if this is how they really feel. On top of that, these real bodily experiences where students talked about having headaches or feeling sick, and that wasn't only while they were in these particular environments during class. They said how this could continue for hours or even sometimes days afterwards, meaning that they then had to stay at home and of course would miss further classes. This next slide is a picture of one of the cafeterias, student cafeterias on campus at the University of Tasmania. And the participant diary says, "I could not go inside, even to take a picture." And this shows the extent of exclusion. These sensory barriers may be invisible, but they're no less real than asking somebody in a wheelchair at the bottom of a set of staircase to get up to the top. The social inclusion aspect, which I'm now talking about on the next slide, we showed two pictures of classrooms at the University of Tasmania, one with rows of desks and the other one with a different arrangement of square tables that you can move around. And two very powerful quotes from the same participant. For the ones with rows of desks, he says, "When I was taking this photo, I felt angry, trapped, hate, get out of my way." These are really, really strong words, a very negative response to the environment. Conversely, in the image with the square tables, he says, "When I was taking this photo, I felt relaxed, collaborative, engaged." The reason for this feeling trapped is a sort of forced social interaction. There's no choice in the tables, in the rows. He gets locked into sitting next to someone, being on view from the lecturer, unable to get out. No choices about his social interaction, and this causes a great deal of anxiety and stress. This next slide is a quote from one of the participants where she says, "I had made a conscious decision some time ago now that I had to build myself up as much as I possibly can to all of that to get by in life. Otherwise, I'd just be in my little cocoon all the time at home, and that's not healthy." And what she's talking about here is the importance of university life, of the campus environment, as a relatively low-risk, contained space to develop skills in social interaction. She talks about how she observes people from a safe distance, understanding some of the social norms. And I think this is something that we really need to recognize. It's not only about academic attainment, but it's about the broader role and opportunities that universities offer for lifelong learning, for the capacity to go forward and to engage successfully in social life as well as in employment. This next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the cognitive aspects, so the perception, the ways of making sense of the environment. This photo here is simply about some of the room numbers, which I think any of us at the University of Tasmania, and perhaps many of you in other higher education institutions, will certainly recognize this madness of room numbering. And she says, I don't understand why there are so many numbers and codes for the same room. I have often got lost. I don't understand, and the campus map either, as that is a coded mess. And she's absolutely right. I'm an architect, I'm used to reading maps, and I have problems understanding the campus map and navigating the campus environment. The difference for me is if I'm lost, I will actually ask someone, whereas a student, because of the social interaction, the dislike of some of the social interaction, the fear, uncertainty of how that will unfold, the student won't do that. So she has missed whole classes when they've moved the room and she's unable to navigate and find the new tutorial space. This next slide is also about the cognitive environment, and I think this is really important because it shows that this difficulty in making sense of the environment, of knowing where to go, is not only to do with navigating between buildings, but it's also about navigating within spaces. This is a photograph of one of the new learning environments, again at the University of Tasmania, and she says, this photo makes me think about how I spent a lot of the lesson trying to work out which way to sit. There are whiteboards almost the whole way around the room. This added to my confusion. So if she is spending a lot of the lesson trying to figure out where to look and what to do, obviously this affects academic issues as she's unable to fully concentrate on the lesson. On this next slide, I'll put this in because I wanted to explain the diversity. So this space that we're looking at here is one of the nursing labs at the University of Tasmania, and it is quite a confusing open space. But for this student with autism spectrum disorder, he finds this very good. The fact that there's less structure, it's more casual and self-directed. He says, the whole atmosphere changes a bit. You can kind of realize that you're allowed to do that there aren't really rules in place. It's more something that just flows. So it's not a one-size-fits-all for students with autism spectrum disorder. It's important that we understand this diversity and respond to each student's individual unique needs. The following few slides I'm going to talk about some of the supports that are provided, and in this first slide I'm going to talk about what we would traditionally think of as supports. At the University of Tasmania on the Hobart campus we have a Student Access Study Centre which is provided for students with disabilities. We also provide online and distance education support, learning access plans, and indeed staff awareness and support. And you can see here from the quote from one of the participants how important the staff awareness and support is, where she says if it wasn't for her lecturer she would have pulled the pin. I wouldn't be there now at all. I would have thought, no, this is just too hard. I just feel like an idiot. This next slide shows a support, which is a disability support. It's a picture of the disabled symbol of someone in a wheelchair in a disabled parking bay. And first of all, the student says, I feel a bit sad that the logo is highlighting difference and the stereotype that someone with a challenge therefore must be in a wheelchair. This photo makes me think about wanting to redesign the concept of disability. Now the context for this photograph, the student regularly parks her car in this spot and it's important for her. She uses her car as a place of retreat. She's on the Launceston campus where there is no disability access centre, so she uses her car as an alternative place of retreat. It's very important that she can access the disability parking bay. It's very close to the building so she can get there quickly. But she says she's experienced people looking at her as she's got out of her car in her high heels and suggesting that that's not right, she doesn't belong there, she shouldn't be parking in the disabled parking bay. So it's really, really important that we think about the staff awareness, of peer awareness of these issues, but also arguably to change the symbols that continually tie disability to particular mobility impairments. This next slide is the start of what I want to talk about. I've called them informal supports. So these are things that students at the University of Tasmania found useful. They use these as supports, but they're not explicitly provided by the university to support students with disabilities, or any students in fact. One of the first of these is the spaces around campus, which are often outside spaces, which are seen to be calmer, safer places of retreat that the students use. And the participant here talks about some of the qualities of these spaces. What they have in common is a kind of open space, easy to navigate, not too busy, not too quiet, but open. And he's talking about another space that's open and outdoors, but at the same time closed and contained by the walls of the buildings. So there's a lot of complexity here. It's not that the students want to retreat to entirely isolated spaces. They want to be part of the campus life, but they want to feel something of the security and the containment, the choices of proximity, choices about different forms of sensory stimuli. This next slide shows a hole-in-the-wall cafe that exists, and the student talks about how important this was for her. She says, "The lady used to save me a sandwich each day. It was much safer here than other places that sold food. She probably never knew how much she helped me that first year." The idea that some places that sell food are safer than others is a very, very different notion of safety. And this was a real point of a refuge, a support for the student that wasn't recognized. And there's a risk if we don't recognize the importance of these informal supports, that with rationalization in the university, with the trend towards wanting to make things more dynamic and interactive, that some of these spaces may disappear. This next slide is a picture of one of the filtered water stations on campus and some vending machines. Many students talked about the importance of water, accessing water when they were feeling stressed or anxious. They needed to drink water. And also students talked about the vending machines. Many of the students choose to come to campus towards the end of the day because it's a little bit quieter. So they can still participate in some level of social interaction, but it's not as overwhelming, it's not as noisy, it's not as visually stimulating. And also, if they are unable to enter the cafes, whether that's because during the middle of the day they're extremely busy and overwhelming and seem to be inaccessible, or because by coming to campus towards the end of the day, the cafes are no longer open, the vending machines become important forms of supports of sustenance for students on campus. This next slide is a picture of a lecture theatre, and what I'm talking about here is the importance of escape. So students are much more able to participate in the university during classes if they feel like they have an option for escape. And many students talked about this, and there was many pictures of lecture theatres. And the student talks about how her strategy for managing to participate in the lesson, in the lecture theatre, I tend to pick a spot all the time. Even in the lecture room, I pick a chair. That's my chair. She often arrives as much as she can before class so that she can pick her preferred spot. And picking the preferred spot can be quite difficult. You don't want too many people behind you, you don't want too many people in front of you, you want to easily be able to nip out the back door without being seen too much by the lecturer, but you want to pick spots where you're avoiding glare on the whiteboards. So it can be quite complicated, and indeed the student talked about the challenges if she comes into the lecture theatre and her preferred spot is taken. And then this last slide about escape highlights some of the differences. The student wants to escape to the Student Access Centre. So if she's feeling overwhelmed, this is her go-to place. This is a picture of the scary self-opening door at the Student Access Centre. It's hard to remember to stop when I am in a rush to get to the safety of the SASC. So the scary self-opening door is, of course, a means to support egress from the building in terms of fire. It opens automatically, particularly for people in wheelchairs. And for this student, she's not moving, trying to escape from the building. She's trying to escape into the building. And in those terms of anxiety, as she moves towards it, she can never remember, even though she's been there many, many times before, because she's stressed, because she's looking down, that she comes up to the door, she's moving very quickly, and it almost always, just about hits her in the face, and then that causes her even more anxiety on top of the way she's already feeling. So to conclude, you can see that there are so many complexities around supporting students with autism spectrum disorder. And I thought this quote from a participant was very powerful. And she says, "You have to be assertive to be autistic. The world doesn't owe me anything, and I don't like to play the victim, where I just put it out there and say, look, I'm autistic, I just need your assistance." This is a mature age student who's come to this position, and I think she's much more able to cope. But for many of the students, they're not declaring the disability, they have very great and varied needs, and these are really not understood, so it's really not a very supportive environment. And we all need to take some responsibility, the students themselves in this capacity for self-advocacy, but also creating more inclusive environments so that they feel supported in making those declarations and are offered opportunities to support their own individual needs. So the conclusions that we found from the study in relation to disability support specifically, we believe there is an importance for individualized assistance. Learning access plans are useful, but we need to look at their effective implementation. So it's not enough just to give someone a learning access plan and then expect them to be proactive entirely in talking to their lecturers about their particular needs and accommodations. But we need to provide advice to staff about how to help the students identify those issues, how to help them discuss those issues so that there can be shared communication. So for the students, we also need to focus on developing social self-management and advocacy skills in order to enable them to do this. And the development of peer mentoring programs does seem to be particularly effective means of support for students with autism spectrum disorder. In relation to pedagogy, we could learn a lot from my colleague Christopher Rayner, who focuses on universal design for learning to foster more inclusive practices in the classroom. We really need to promote greater awareness and understanding of autism spectrum disorder, particularly among the teaching staff. And we need to enable students to exercise their own agency and manage their own learning journey in whatever diverse forms that may take. And indeed, many of the students in our study at the University of Tasmania showed how much initiative they had taken themselves in crafting their own learning journey, some very innovative, almost sometimes slightly subversive ways in which they were navigating online systems and built environment aspects to support their journey through university. Conclusions around the design of the built environment include we need to consider that we need to design campus spaces holistically. We can't only think about particular disability access spaces. We need to think about pathways to them. We might think about designing quiet spaces in the library, but we'd need to think about how students get to them. There's no point in putting a quiet learning space in the library if you then need to move past the coffee cart positioned at the front entranceway. It's already going to be inaccessible. We need spaces to facilitate navigation and engagement, and we also need to provide opportunities for withdrawal. As universities are moving towards more dynamic learning environments, a greater focus on sort of intensive activity, I think some of those opportunities for withdrawal, for the quiet spaces, may be overlooked. So it's important that we put that front and foremost on the agenda together with the need for the dynamic interactive spaces. The study also showed how there can be many low-cost simple adjustments, like, for example, the ticking clocks or the flickering lights, and how this can really make a big difference to the well-being of students and to their academic attainment. Yes, the recent trend towards hyper-stimulating learning spaces needs to be balanced with access to quiet environments with natural features. The green spaces, trees and so on are often very calming for everyone, but particularly with the need for students with autism spectrum disorder. And finally, we really need to develop relevant policy and design guidelines where these needs of students with autism spectrum disorder are specifically recognized. And even though there is a diversity of needs, I think there are some key things that we can do within the policy guidelines that would support the broad population. We also looked in the study at the possibilities for support under the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And one of the key opportunities that we've identified here is the opportunity to broaden the peer mentor role. At the moment it focuses particularly on transitioning into university and to a certain extent transitioning out of university. But what we noticed in the study is that there are a series of micro transitions that happen across the whole learning journey. And we would like to see the opportunities of expanding this peer mentor role across the entire learning journey. We also believe that we need to clarify the type of support available under the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It will talk about supports that are reasonable and necessary, but at the moment there's very little information about what that means. So we need further research that looks at the specific needs of students with autism spectrum disorder so that we can build the empirical basis for recognizing and expanding the support that's available under the NDIS. Finally, I'd just like to talk about recognized limitations of the study and future directions. A key limitation of the study is obviously that it was conducted with a very small group of students. This was partly because of the time frame of the research. It's also extraordinarily difficult to recruit students with autism spectrum disorder, particularly during semester where they're already overwhelmed with other needs, their academic requirements in order to undertake the study. But recognizing these limitations in future research, we would like to expand the size of the participants, the number of participants in the study. But we also recognize that the students who participated in our study were still actively engaged in education. And we need to also focus on individuals with ASD who have entered higher education but who have failed to graduate, and indeed students with ASD who are perfectly competent and who are interested in accessing higher education, but who have failed to access it. So in future studies, we will be seeking to expand the participants to encompass those groups. And I will just leave you with this last slide, which I liked because it challenges some of the things around my field in architecture. And the student says, I took this photo because I keep on wanting to fix the skewed building. When I was taking this photo, I felt a bit agitated. And this photo makes me think about why people design buildings this way, why they build them incorrectly, which makes me think about how I design in my field. And I will leave it with that. Thank you for listening.
That's a fabulous ending there, Carud. Yes, that's a recently built new add-on to the Student Centre in the Launceston campus, and I think it's challenging for most of us, but I'm sure for students on the spectrum it is even more so, because as ghastly as it is on the outside and as skewed as it is, the inside is just as bad. So thank you very much for that presentation. It's been fantastic to hear how the research has been, even though I was a part of it. It's just nice to kind of see it all in this way, and the experiences that you shared with the students is so powerful, and I found that during the research and just once again reinforced in your presentation. We haven't had many questions, but there is a question that someone's asked in regards to the research being available after the research that is available, and I suppose, I don't know if Sue or if you want to say that, Kerwin, where people can see the research?
Yeah, I mean, the report was just published last Friday, so it was on the 1st of April. But it's available on the NCCHE website. So if you go there, and there's a link to reports, and I think at this point it's right at the top because it's the latest one to be published, and you can download the full report, and there's an executive summary of the findings, but then all the detail. Is quite a lengthy report.
Yep, excellent. It will also be available on ADSET, so with the link, the webinar link and so forth, it's actually on the ADSET website as well. So hopefully people will, definitely be able to find it.
Yeah.
We've just
I'd also be very happy for anyone to contact me by email.
Yep.
I'm not sure if my email details are up there, but I'm quite easy to find if you put me in, look at the University of Tasmania. I'm pretty sure I am the only Carudwin here, but please feel free to email me if you would like to get in touch or have any particular questions.
I think probably Jane might be able to put it up into the chat pod that everybody will be able to see. There is just another question. Are University of Tasmania going to implement any of the changes as suggested by the students in this study?
That's a great question. I very much hope so. The University of Tasmania is looking at doing a lot of new development over the next 5 years. I'm currently working with my 5th year Master of Architecture students on thinking about design guidelines that we can develop so that when the university moves into those new developments, we can provide them with best practice information about what they should be considering. The library, people who are in control of the library are very interested, and they have contacted me recently to say that they would like us to provide information on what we could do right now to make the library a more accessible environment for students with autism spectrum disorder. So we'll be looking at some low-cost modifications, as they're not going to wait, for another 3 to 5 years to have new facilities. They want to make those changes right now, and I will be presenting the results of this study widely in the university to the student experience committee and other senior people as opportunities arise to be proactive in trying to make this environment better. I'll be very happy to provide the information to anyone else if it's useful in other higher education institutions.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for everybody else for joining us. I'll just do a quick plug for our next webinar. It will be held on the 3rd of May, and the topic for that is going to be using technology in the classroom for deaf students. So we'll be promoting that soon. So just in wrapping up, I just want to thank the National Centre and Sue for joining us today. Also to Bradley Reporting for their wonderful captioning. Jason's done a great job once again today. And also to you, Caridwen, it's fantastic to see this research come into fruition and to hear you speak today. So thank you everybody for participating.
Thank you.
Cheers.